Welcome to GMA Talk. This week's episode, we're very honored to be having a representative or somebody who works with the UNHCR in Canada to talk to us about refugee situations in Canada and also just light in terms of the integration specifics in Canada and just the refugee socio-economic implications in Canada. So welcome to GMA Talk and welcome to you, Michael, for today.
Thanks for having me, Gerard.
So I'm glad that you could join this time with us, and thank you very much for your time to be able to paint to us the light and the picture, especially in this time with a crazy amount of people displaced around the world and refugees being more and more as a result of conflict. So with that, without wasting any time, really, we'll just dive into it. And the first aspect of the conversation is, can you just paint a picture for us, please, in terms of what is currently happening in the world in terms of migration and refugees, especially the challenges of COVID-19?
Sure. No, thanks again for the invitation. I mean, we're speaking at a time where the number of displaced people continues to grow. And when we released our stats over the summer, and the estimates are that there are about almost 80 million people displaced. And when I say displaced, I'm talking about refugees, but also internally displaced, people who are like refugees, but still inside their country of origin. In terms of the number of refugees, and then there's asylum seekers, the people displaced by the situation in Venezuela, as well as stateless persons. But concerning the number of refugees, there's about 26 million. And again, that is a new high over the previous years. But what's been key now in the context of COVID is that the refugee situations didn't resolve. And on top of some people describe it as a crisis upon a crisis.
Wow.
That the refugee population, the causes of why refugees had to flee haven't gone away. And now refugees are finding themselves in greater danger as a result of the COVID crisis and pandemic. And so we're seeing, for example, in 134 countries, and I can't give you specific stats as to the number of refugees who unfortunately have been affected by COVID, but we're seeing COVID breakouts in some of the populations who can bear it least, right? So we were having incidents, for example, of COVID being discovered among the Rohingya population in the Cox's Bazar region in Bangladesh, or in Yemen, for example, where you have talked about a situation of a crisis upon a crisis. The situation in Yemen where we've had massive flooding, we've had food shortages, we have cholera outbreaks, and we have an active conflict going on. And so COVID has just been one more problem. And so it's difficult for refugees to obviously take advantage of some of the mechanisms you and I are able to take of in terms of, protecting ourselves or preventing the spread of COVID-19. So this is the particular challenge. So we've actually had to reach out and I'll mention in a moment what we're doing. But we've asked for another $745 million from states, of which we've already received 62% as part of a $10 billion appeal that the UN has been making to states to respond to COVID. And what we're doing with that money is actually trying different approaches. For example, it's not just PPE, which it's funny that it's become part of our vocabulary. PPE is.
I know, that's very weird.
It shows the cultural change that it's had, but and it's jerry cans, the usual sort of assistance. But it's also counseling. It's also setting up phone lines, because our staff have not left. Our staff are still there, but in many situations, our offices are closed because of government orders. So we're having to work remotely, like so many Canadians are having to do when we're engaging the refugees and asylum seekers. But one of the key points of support has actually been cash assistance, because The truth, and the unfortunate truth, is that many refugees rely on working in the informal sector.
Mm-hmm.
And these are some of the first jobs that evaporated with COVID-19 restrictions. As the restrictions on them, there was no, informal sector to work in. And so refugees, again, they're seeing their livelihoods dry up. So it's been so critical that we provide cash as an assistance so they can, their basic needs are met. So we've already dispersed about $50 million to refugees just as cash assistance, and about 60 different countries.
Mm.
But the other piece that's happening is that so many refugees also benefit from remittances from family members in industrialized countries. Yet
Mm-hmm.
these same family members have been affected by COVID. So the financial support that they were providing to refugees is also drying up from overseas. So they're being affected from many different angles by the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much in terms of painting that very clear picture for us. As you said, with the lot of challenges which of the displacement that we're already having, and now on top of that, having this pandemic and COVID like among us, it's a very challenge in terms of, as you say, people not being able even to keep the distance among themselves in a refugee camp or refugee settlement because most of them they're already overcrowded, and then even like sanitation measurement, it's often a challenge. So I'm very glad to hear that in terms of the world and government appeals, in terms of further helping, in terms of displaced internally and also just refugees around the world. So I'm very glad to hear that. But then in terms of when you look at to the situations that's happening in Canada specifically, I understand that a while back, there were reports that of migrants and refugees crossing from the United States to Canada as a result of maybe wishing to seek asylum in Canada instead of US. Can you talk to us about any update on people crossing from US into Canada and why were people crossing from US into Canada?
Sure. I mean, Canada has an established asylum system, one of the best in the world for determining people who claim asylum, and that's quite normal. That the Refugee Convention sets out the responsibilities of states to receive people and to determine whether or not they need international protection and protect them
Mm-hmm.
from refoulement. The idea that refugees should not be forcefully returned to the country from
Yes.
in any manner whatsoever from which they fear persecution. Now, I can't give you numbers right now, but the numbers have obviously drastically reduced
Mm-hmm.
because of the border measures that everybody's aware of that are ongoing. Now, UNHCR's view is, of course, that we understand entirely the need for public health measures and such, but we also believe that it's the protection of refugees is not irreconcilable with that. There are measures that can be taken place. So there have been some coming, and we're always concerned to make sure that these sort of restriction measures don't carry on forever. But we've
Mm-hmm.
received assurances from the government that these are temporary. We
Okay.
don't know, unfortunately, like everybody else, the COVID pandemic can't end soon enough for everyone, and that's including us.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I can't give you specific numbers because I'm not aware at this time.
For sure.
But we know the numbers have obviously dropped
Mm-hmm.
dramatically since last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the asylum system continues to work. The Immigration Refugee Board, those people who've made claims, who've
Mm-hmm.
come previously, they are going through the asylum system. There are measures that the Immigration Refugee Board is taking to ensure the health and protection of everybody involved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, yeah, for highlighting that into us. So when you talk in terms of the immigration board and asylum seekers, like systems like continuing to happen and people continuing to seek shelter and refuge in the country, then among Canadians, what is the general feelings when it comes to refugees, whether these people who are crossing to seek asylum or just in general refugees coming through the IOM and with government resettlement programs?
Sure, no, thanks. It's interesting because the polls, I mean, in 2015, 2016, when the Canadians were so caught up in the Syrian crisis and were
Mm-hmm.
so generous in their response. But what's been really impressive is there's been quite a bit of carryover of that. And we know that it's sort of public attitudes fallen off. For a period of time, there was some concern about whether, especially concern about we call irregular arrivals, people who were not arriving at port of entries, and whether that was affecting the public attitudes. But polls continue to show that Canadians get it. Canadians understand that refugees need protection, and so while that support goes up and down, when they look over decades, and
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately I can't cite the figures, overall there's an increasing support generation by generation of for the protection of refugees.
Yeah.
And what I find it really interesting is that they're in the same polls, even though right now during the pandemic, there's questions being raised, about immigration levels.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make sense to continue at whatever level? I mean, there's a recognition at the same time that immigration is part of Canada's economic future success.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
And Canadians themselves are coming to greater terms with that. I've talked to officials who've done sort of focus groups, and when they say to them, oh, we're going to bring, how do you feel about bringing 340,000 immigrants to Canada, including refugees,
Mm-hmm.
next year? And people get very nervous. That sounds like a lot of people, right?
For
But then
sure.
if you say to them, how do you feel about, taking the number that just will barely, if not go under the birth rate, in other words, the population rate, so that our population otherwise might go down, that
Mm-hmm.
people get much more comfortable with it. If you're saying it's 1%, and that 1% is so key to us actually being able to sustain our population levels, then they're much more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the other interesting shifts that's taken in public attitudes is, like, parts of Canada, for example, are very much changing. One area of Canada that's become more and more welcoming towards refugees, or see it part of their future, has actually been Atlantic Canada.
Okay.
And so I was there, like when we talk to officials, they're very interested, and they're actually very interested also in refugees, not just immigration, but in
Mm-hmm.
refugees because they see them as part of their success for the future, because they realize that so many of these communities that are, with a dwindling population, that they see refugees as a potential population that might be more likely to stay and not
Mm.
move. Among all the immigrant groups that come to Canada, the economic immigrants, family class,
Yep.
refugees
Mm-hmm.
are the ones that are more likely to go to smaller communities across Canada. And
Mm-hmm.
so these smaller communities who are so reliant and see immigration as a way to sort of be part of their future
Yeah.
are looking to them. But there's also one more piece I would just want to mention. I mean, what I find really interesting is also, the role that actually, sort of mental shift that we're seeing, where the business community have actually become more of our allies
Mm-hmm.
in terms of recognizing how important even refugees are to Canada's economic situation. And so think of the story of Tarakadat, right? The guy who started Peace by Chocolates, his family,
Oh yes, he recently became a
in
Canadian
Antigonish,
citizen.
that whole story of how he launched his business, right?
Yeah.
Part of the secret ingredient of that, as I know the story, is Sobeys, the grocery chain across Canada, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people at Sobeys, who are also based in Atlantic Canada, discovered their chocolate at a small market, this sort of farmer's market type thing, where they were selling chocolate as been their heritage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was that employer that sort of unlocked those opportunities as they made available the chocolate across the chain. And now you can't go into Halifax Airport without seeing, Peace by Chocolates
Wow,
everywhere, right?
that's
And
amazing.
so I say that as sort of, it's not just public attitudes, but it's also
Mm-hmm.
the different sectors and the recognition that refugees are an important contribution. And I would argue that you see this generation after generation, Canadians are more and more recognizing that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
sorry if I go on one more piece.
Yeah, for sure. No problem. Continue.
No, I mean, if you look back since 1980, about what Canada has resettled about 1 million refugees, welcomed about 1 million refugees.
Yeah.
Now, you don't go out the door every day and go, my God, look at all these refugees out there.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're your neighbors. They're people in your lives.
For
They
sure.
might be the caregiver for your child. It might be your dentist. It might be the person who gave you a loan for your to buy your house. They are, again, because Canada has
Mm.
done, one of the keys to Canada's success has been its integration.
Yeah.
And while some people get worried, are we doing a good job? And certainly there are higher standards. When we look at how other countries are doing, Canada is an example in
Yeah.
terms of its integration, because it really wants refugees to become part of its society. It really wants to welcome them and encourage them
Yeah.
to become citizens. And that formula, that approach is paying off.
Mm. Wow, that's very amazing, and thank you very much for going through the information, especially when you talk about in terms of the Atlantic Canada in terms of being open to immigrants and also refugees, right? Because when I think of it, I wouldn't think in terms of maybe when you say like small communities. refugee being willing in terms of like settling in some of these communities and making their home in these communities within Canada, right? And then when you also talk about in terms of the current pandemic and governments and people like looking at in terms of like immigration levels, in terms of like, okay, what's the future of immigration, what the future of refugees like within the country, and how best to go about it, when and that time when we come out of this pandemic. So when you look at those issues and challenges of refugee resettlement and integration, so what are some of the services and support UNHCR specifically offers like to refugees here in Canada on those levels and issues?
Well, I mean, one of the great fortunate things is I work for UNHCR in Canada. We're a very small office because we don't deliver services to Canada. The Canadian government does. So where UNHCR delivers services is because the governments in those countries, rely on our support to either provide,
Yes.
registration or asylum or humanitarian assistance. But a country like Canada, you don't come to me if you want to make a refugee claim. You go to the Immigration and Refugee Board. Oh, you don't register with the UNHCR when you arrive at the Canadian Border Services Agency. So
Yes.
we're fortunate that we have that, but it's not just that it's a wealthier country, but it's also has a lot of experience, right? One of the things that is really helpful in Canada is that you have this, what we call the settlement sector, these organizations who have met a great deal of experience in welcoming refugees and other immigrants to our communities. And that includes everything from language training to initial orientation. I mean, it's even become one of the interesting areas that's developed, and I think has become more and more recognition of its importance. It's settlement workers in schools. I mean, I would argue schools are an important place of integration that we often don't think about, because the schools play an important role in terms of, and we're seeing the success of that. It's not easy for refugee kids when they first come to the country to find their way, but they are finding their way, and they're seeing great results. But as far as our office in Canada, our role is basically to work with the Canadian government.
Okay.
So we're coordinating on who they should be selecting for resettlement overseas. We're providing guidance on asylum issues and collaboration and with other states. And then we're also trying to communicate, as I am today with you, in terms of so the public understands, the challenges but also, more about refugees and what the opportunities they provide. And lastly, I've got to say is also, which goes back to, I mean, Canada is an important donor to UNHCR. I mean, I referenced how important the gap we have in terms of funding that we're facing. But, one of the things that shows to me the support that Canadians have for refugees is actually private donations, what we call private sector partnerships or private sector fundraising. Even after the Syrian emergency, the amount of money Canadians were giving to UNHCR continued to go up. And even during this time of COVID, our donations are continuing to go up.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, that shows that Canadians get it. They understand how fortunate they are. They understand the plight of refugees, and they understand the important role they can play as donors in providing refugees with assistance.
Yeah, very nice and very important indeed, the role that you have explained in terms of the UNHCR Canada office does in terms of working and in partnership with the government and other organizations in the country, and also in terms of delivering the information on that level. So in terms of the integration, because you have spoke a little bit about integration, and then you have even highlighted a little bit on education aspect. So when it comes to the integration aspect of refugees in the country, what are some challenges and resources needed? And then maybe you can also add now to the partnership that UNHCR has in the country, including to which you have already spoke with as of the government.
No, I mean, as much as, and I will, I will tout the success of Canada in terms of integration. I don't want to suggest by any means that it's easy.
For sure.
It is a great challenge to change, to move to a different country, to oftentimes you don't speak the language, cultural environment is entirely different. It's a lot to take in, and anybody who's immigrated to this country, to Canada, will tell you it's not plug and play, right?
For sure.
Doesn't matter how prepared you are. It is quite a challenge. That being said, and many of them come, for example, when we identify refugees for resettlement to Canada, the reasons we're identifying them have nothing to do with how they will integrate, and would they make, this is a really nice guy, so he'd be a great neighbor for you, instead, we're looking for those people who are most vulnerable. Those people have the greatest protection challenges. But yet, what's amazing is that the settlement with those supports that Canada provides, they're able to find their way through it. I mean, the financial support that refugees get, I mean, they face some of the same challenges many Canadians do. Housing is very difficult.
For sure.
For example, is one of the biggest barriers. Those people who are on social assistance know it's very hard to make ends meet, and refugees effectively arrive here at the same levels as those financial support as those people on social assistance. But what we find is they make it, right? They make it. When we look at studies, and I'm talking about the most recent, census results.
Yeah, for sure.
When we look at that, when we look at the employment, looking at the last 25 years, refugees who've arrived over the last 25 years, the unemployment rate for them on average, now this is pre-pandemic numbers, but if you look at those, the average of those people, including those people who just arrived the day before, the unemployment rate is 9%, whereas the average Canadian unemployment rate is 6%. I mean, that is really close when you consider that refugees, again, weren't selected for this. It takes them a period of time to adjust. But what we see is that year over year over year over year, their situation gets better and better and better. And that's really one of the important keys that, I don't think refugees ever will achieve the average Canadian-born income, but their situation does improve, and it improves again for the next generation. And so we know, for example, after about 20 years in being in Canada, that refugees actually contribute more in taxes than they actually receive, just in federal taxes, not all the other taxes we pay every day, just in federal taxes, than they actually receive in services. And one of the reasons, though, that it takes them that period of time, actually, it seems to relate to the fact that they have larger families, which Canada actually needs, because Canada's got a population thing. So the fact that they have larger families, they need more services. But what's the key is that they continues to go up. And one of the other pieces, as I started talking about education, one of the keys that Canada's had in terms of success with education is that children who arrive in Canada as refugees have a greater graduation or success rate in high school, in college, in university, and postgraduate degrees than Canadian-born kids. Now, does that mean that refugees are smarter than Canadian-born kids? No, of course not. Okay. What it means is the system works. And if you give people the opportunity for this, then they will have those opportunities to succeed later. And so that's, again, we see the sort of payoff over time.
Wow, that's it's very amazing in terms of painting the picture of the achievements and the enrollment or the achievement in employment, because most of the time, especially with so much negative perception that is going on around the world, when you start talking about like government assistance, government services, people have this negative perception that refugees are burden to the society, refugees are burden to the countries, and the government is investing and giving refugees a lot of money, to which most of the time that is not true, because the refugees and migrants, they go through the same social system if the help and support is needed, right? But it's very great to know of the achievement in terms of education and employment for refugees. So then you already in terms of a little bit highlighted to which aspect and which ways Canadian societies in terms of support refugees, but and then in other ways, then how do refugees themselves or former refugees give back to the country beside the tax system?
One of the things that is really interesting, and I keep touting integration, and I know people work very hard on integration of all newcomers, and they always worry about, so I don't want to play it as easy, because as I've said, it's not easy, right? But the results Canada achieves are so far different than, say, some of the European states, for example, and I think some of the strategies that Canada's applied. But I mean, it's sort of, I always have a hard time going, what does it mean to give back and such? I mean, there's examples, that we've seen in terms of society where, the Vietnamese community were so active in being involved in trying to sponsor other Syrian refugees. But again, many of them find their way into Canadian life. But I think one of the key indicators is actually how they embrace Canada. Of all the immigrant groups, refugees have the highest citizenship rate. of all. I believe it's 88%, and I think for families like 86 or 84. It's close, but refugees are high, and it's not easy to get a citizenship. You have to speak the language, you have to find the money
Yes.
and such. But this is a really important objective. But when the refugees are also polled, and Canadians are polled, their
Mm-hmm.
sense of belonging to Canada.
Wow.
91% of Canadians, they say they have a sense of belonging to Canada. 95% of refugees say the sense of belonging to Canada.
Wow.
So I think that's part of that conversation where Canada welcomes them, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Canada wants you to be part of Canada, and they give you the space to say, you know, we respect your faith, we respect your heritage and such, and in turn you respect the laws, and we want you to succeed. We want
Mm-hmm.
you to find your way through this country. And I don't want to again paint a rosy picture, because the same issues that affect, for example, visible minorities in Canada, the same
Mm-hmm.
barriers, refugees experience them. As much as I've told you, you know, that the education attainment of refugees has been so high, what we find is that that they don't get, for those who get those degrees, they
Mm-hmm.
don't achieve the same level as Canadian born in terms of salary. But
Mm.
it is an improvement. It is an improvement. And why we think that is probably is more likely because they're more likely to be visible minorities, which is the problem, which is a challenge for visible minorities in Canada.
Yeah.
They don't achieve the same thing either in terms of Canadian born, you know, in terms of the salaries they get linked with
Yeah.
those degrees. But it is, they're on their way up, and that's the key for us. You know, there's not a plateau. It's not that they're stuck in a rut. Their situation does improve. So as they succeed, Canada succeeds, right? And we're seeing that, and I think there's greater recognition in that. And that doesn't speak to, I mean, I'm focusing, Gerard, and I always feel uncomfortable because we always tend to talk about the money aspect, because it's
Mm-hmm.
not just the value of, you know, the economy and dollars and cents being how we measure things, but
Yeah.
also it's the easiest thing to count, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
easy thing to count independently. But you know, the person's place in their community, the fact that they're volunteers, the fact that
Mm-hmm.
they, you know, in terms of what they're giving to whether they're sports league and you know, and such, their kids are playing soccer on, or whatever. These are harder to quantify, unfortunately. But
Mm.
what I can say is, you know, that they do embrace this country, and that's key.
Okay. Wow. Oh, yeah, very, very, in terms of, yeah, as you say, the numbers, it's very easy to to put a picture in terms of the money aspect. But yeah, even from hearing the from other people, I know, even from experience, yeah, I know for sure there are a lot of refugees who are indeed giving back to the society, and most of the time giving back even to fellow refugee who are
Yeah.
in the same journey that they are in or they was in. So it's a very great to see that, like a very cycle and a very chain of refugees really being sometimes the ones who are at the forefront of welcoming people.
And you know, and that's something I wanted to add. When we started our conversation by talking about COVID, right? And one
Mm-hmm.
of the key things that has developed, a very positive thing, the our High Commissioner Filippo Grandi
Mm-hmm.
was put out a press release when he had heard about it to acknowledge it, was that on the 14th of August, Canada, you might have heard Minister Mendicino, the Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship, announced a special program for asylum seekers who are frontline healthcare workers,
Mm-hmm. Yes, yep,
and
I've heard
and,
that. Yeah.
and so they could apply immediately for permanent resident status.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this, you know, these people are playing you know, taking on jobs that, you know, many Canadians aren't doing, and are so
Mm-hmm.
critical, quite frankly, in terms of the health and welfare of more vulnerable Canadians. So,
Yeah.
you know, they're, as you say, they are giving back, and in
Mm-hmm.
turn, there's more of a recognition now among Canadians
Yeah.
saying, oh, you know, this is the sort of benefit they're actually have been doing on the sidelines, and we just haven't been noticing.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's yeah, very great in terms of, yeah, bringing that into perspective, yeah, especially with the news that, with many asylum seekers here in Canada specifically, they've been working in the front line, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in farming, in the social services. So yeah, that was very great in terms of from the Ministry of Refugees, Citizenship and Immigration, to really recognize the work that the refugees and asylum seekers, they are doing within the country and the system. So then, in terms of trying to bring everything to perspective and everything together, maybe we can a little bit stick on the topic of COVID and the challenges that are happening around the world. So, how can regular people, regular citizens, assist refugees and migrants and asylum seekers around the world, especially at this time where leaders in most of the countries, they are caring more about what is happening within the border with all the challenges. Whether you're looking in Europe with the EU, they're not so very much united with the migrants, coming from a Mediterranean Sea. And you already, in terms of touch a little bit on what is happening in Yemen, which is like over 5 years now, it's still happening over like millions needing humanitarian aid, and then still hosting thousands of refugees in Yemen itself. So when you look at all these hotspots and conflicts and pandemic which is happening in the world, like how can people best help and support refugees around the world and internally displaced people?
Well, I mean, I would say two things, and certainly you're right in terms of COVID tends to restrict, what's potentially possible. But I mean, the first one, and I've alluded to it, is funding.
Mm,
If people can spare money, and we'd be grateful for it because it's really important for the services. Those cash-based assistance has become even more critical. And so, if people are interested, to find out more or are able to donate, go to our website, unhcr.ca. Again,
mm-hmm,
unhcr.ca, and if you're able to donate. But the second thing I would highlight is one of the things, and it's been a bit on hiatus, but we're seeing it start to reopen. It's a very Canadian model. Is actually the private sponsorship of refugees program,
yes.
right? I mean, the private sponsored refugees, 58% of the refugees who've come to Canada over the last 10 years have actually come through private sponsors. And what
Okay.
that, for those, I mean, most Canadians are kind of are familiar with by now, and it's a very simple notion, is basically, we have a group of 5 or more Canadians or a faith community or some other incorporated group who come
Mm-hmm,
together and say, and we will look after that refugee when they come to Canada. And what I mean by look after, it's not just financial, it's our volunteer time, we'll
mm-hmm,
help them orient them. They don't have to be, experts in integration or social workers. They need just to help someone who will help them find their way around the community.
yeah.
And what we found is that, when we look at studies on how refugees integrate, the privately sponsored refugees actually take off faster. I mean, I use the metaphor of takeoff, but they tend to more likely become economically independent
Mm-hmm.
before the government assisted refugees. And a lot of that is believed because of the support of the sponsoring group,
No,
that they
okay.
provide that social capital. They provide
Mm-hmm,
that way. So, if you're a refugee and I'm a part of a sponsor group and I'm saying, well, the
mm-hmm.
refugee doesn't know people and they're looking for a job, but I know people who are employers.
Yeah.
I can say, well, the refugee we sponsored, like, he's a reliable guy. I think you should look at employing. So it helps expand those opportunities. This private sponsorship model is actually right now, over the last couple of years, is actually growing as a model in other countries. So
Mm-hmm,
there's been an initiative called the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, which is trying to effectively share the Canadian model to other countries.
yeah.
And it's not, I mean, other countries have different legal formats, but this idea of engaging our citizens. And what's key about private sponsorship is two aspects. It provides opportunities for more solutions,
Mm-hmm,
but it also has a social change aspect,
yeah.
in the sense that the people who get involved in private sponsorship, help to make that transition and help to make those social changes in our communities to understand. And in terms of, when I've thrown out a lot of numbers at you, but
Yes.
really those interpersonal relationships,
Mm-hmm,
I mean, they always say to you, talk about communications, tell the story of, that's the story of Tara Kadad speaks volumes more than any stats I can give you,
mm-hmm,
because people can understand and personalize and put into place these ideas together.
mm-hmm.
And private sponsorship helps do that sort of building of community so that refugees don't feel isolated, that they have social support. And there's numerous wonderful stories of private sponsors. I was involved in private, before I joined UNHCR, I was involved in private sponsorship for 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
working at the Roman Catholic Diocese of London. And our faith communities used to, again, play this important role in terms of helping refugees find their way into
Mm-hmm.
Southwest Ontario.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's yeah, in terms of the private sponsorship, yeah, for sure. Even I've looked into it, especially with the recent Global Compact of Refugees and Global Compact of Migration. As of from 2015, 2016, like in terms of like at the heat moment of the Syrian refugees who were going into Europe, and also for those who Canada ended up resettling, which like over like many of them. So yeah, Canada really has been playing a role, and in terms of the private sponsorship, even I believe at the University of at Ottawa University, the law faculty there also looks into
Yeah,
this. Also in
they're
Carleton
one of the partners.
University, yeah, there's also this Professor James Miller, who also like looks into, yeah, in terms of some of this initiative, yeah, which is very great in terms of to see, even though it might not be a perfect model or like a very, which cannot maybe work in other countries with different law and different legal system. It's in terms of looking at how can that be learned from and implicated to work best for the local solutions and the local environment, right?
No, and there's, like I said, several countries, the United Kingdom, Australia, and such. And as you say, the laws are different, but the ingredients are the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the aspect is how can we use, civil society? And
Mm-hmm.
there's some. I mean, I've been on calls. These now it's during COVID, everybody's on calls, but
Yeah.
calls with representatives from these other countries who are speaking about how transformative it is for their community
Mm.
involved and to show a way. And for many people, that's just as important, if not more so, that sort of interpersonal relationship than just a donation, but also the
Yeah.
giving of their time and such.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, yeah, for that information. So, in terms of bringing everything together, I really thank you first of all for really a very richful conversation and information, that you have shared with me and also, the viewers of GMA Talk. It's very important to know what Canada is doing specifically for refugees and also just in terms of the work of the UNHCR in Canada and around the world. So, if you think about everything we have spoken about and the question I've asked about. So anything else that you like to highlight in terms of UNHCR's work or about refugees around the world, or what people should know about refugees around the world?
Well, I would say simply, for more information, go to our website, the unhcr.ca. There you can find links to, there's tons of information UNHCR has in terms of some of the current crises,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're looking for information on that can lead you to, how you can help.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Well, that very simple as that, and I will also post a link of unhcr.ca. And thank you very much, Michael, for your time. Really, I do appreciate. And to the viewers and subscribers of GMA Talk, yeah, thank you very much for joining this week's episode of very informative, very richful information in terms of UNHCR and refugees in Canada and around the world. So until next time, thank you very much.
It's great to talk to you, Sharon. Thanks for having me.